Okay, have you ever actually stopped to wonder if the way you experience your own thoughts, your emotions, or even your identity is completely different from someone living on the exact opposite side of the world? When we talk about psychology, it is incredibly easy to just assume that the blueprints we use to map human behavior apply to everyone everywhere. We kind of treat our minds like standardized hardware, running the exact same operating system. But today we're diving into this explainer to take a really fascinating journey beyond traditional Western frameworks, and we're going to challenge some of the most fundamental ways we think about our own minds.
We often just assume concepts like the ego, self-actualization, or even individualism are these universal constants. But what if they're actually just one tiny piece of a much, much bigger global puzzle? See, importing Western theories to explain every single culture on Earth often leaves out the most nuanced, beautiful parts of the human experience. When we rely on a singular lens, we totally miss out on how deeply different cultures process things like grief or community or joy. I mean, if a society operates entirely on shared community rather than individual success, applying a Western framework to their mental health isn't just inaccurate, it's actively ignoring their reality.
So here is a roadmap for today's explainer. First, psychology beyond the West. Second, the cultural and indigenous mind. Third, roots of Indian psychology. Fourth, metaphors of the mind. Fifth, the concept of ego. And finally, transcending the self.
Let's jump right into section 1, the cultural and indigenous mind. So indigenous psychology fundamentally flips how we look at human behavior. Instead of forcing some imported, external theory onto a population, this discipline builds knowledge entirely from the bottom up. It embraces local beliefs, practices, lived experiences, and it actively rejects the idea that Western frameworks are the only valid way to understand mental health. Think of it as studying human behavior as it naturally grows within its own unique social soil. You wouldn't use the rules of chess to analyze a basketball game, right? Similarly, you absolutely cannot evaluate the mental well-being of an indigenous community using metrics cooked up in a mid-century American laboratory.
To really see the sheer power of this approach in action, let's look at Psikologiyang Pilipino or Filipino psychology. It actually emerged as a direct reaction against Western psychology that simply couldn't explain Filipino behavior. At its absolute core is this concept of kapwa, which roughly translates to a shared inner self or shared identity. Now, in Western hyper-individualism, a neighbor's trauma is mostly their own problem. But under kapwa, during a natural disaster, families will literally open their doors to affected neighbors without anyone even having to ask. Why? Because in this cultural framework, the boundary between you and me is totally permeable. Helping your neighbor is quite literally seen as helping yourself. Treating this community with a highly individualistic mental health approach would totally miss the true source of their resilience. When you map out these different psychological disciplines side by side, some really cool patterns emerge. Indigenous psychology operates globally by pulling from highly localized contexts. Cultural psychology, on the other hand, gives us cross-cultural comparisons. It's a way to see how modern academic theories interact with various societies. But Indian psychology? It's entirely distinct. It originates not just from local norms, but from incredibly deep ancient philosophy and spirituality. While traditional modern psychology often just aims to reduce symptoms of distress, the ultimate goal of Indian psychology is profound self-realization and holistic well-being. These disciplines aren't competing with each other. They're actually working together to create a vastly more inclusive picture of the human mind. Moving on to section 2, roots of Indian psychology. Tracing the history here is a wild journey, because it doesn't start in clinical laboratories with white coats and clipboards. It starts thousands of years ago in ancient, profound texts exploring the soul, the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita. These were essentially humanity's earliest inquiries into consciousness. Fast forward a few millennia to 1915, and we meet a really pivotal figure, Dr. N.N. Sengupta. He was this brilliant, Harvard-educated scholar who came back home to establish the first experimental psychology lab in Calcutta. This was a massive moment. He formally bridged the gap between two worlds, pushing for rigorous empirical science while insisting that we absolutely have to study these phenomena within India's rich cultural and philosophical context. Now, this is super interesting. Ancient Indian thinkers had a remarkably dynamic view of personality. Instead of locking people into fixed, static traits like we so often do today, they saw personality as a fluid composition of three motivating forces called the trigunas. First, you have sattva, which represents purity, harmony, and balance. Think of sattva as that elusive flow state when your mind is perfectly clear. Then there's rajas, the force of action, movement, passion. That's the hustle and drive you feel when you're attacking a tough project. And finally, there is tamas, representing inertia or immediate gratification. Honestly, tamas is that heavy, sluggish feeling that keeps you doom scrolling on the couch for hours when you know you should be in bed. In this model, a healthy person isn't someone who totally eliminates rajas and tamas, but someone who cultivates a really mindful, dynamic balance of all three.
All right, Section 3, Metaphors of the Mind.
What I love is that these ancient texts didn't just deal in high-level, boring theory. They used incredibly vivid stories to explain complex cognitive functions to everyday people. From the Katha Upanishad, we get this brilliantly intuitive chariot metaphor. Imagine you're riding in a chariot. The physical body is the chariot itself. Your senses, your sight, hearing, desires, those are the wild horses pulling it forward. The thinking mind, the manas, acts as the reins connecting the horses to the driver. And your intellect, the buddhi, is the wise charioteer. If the charioteer is wise and holds those reins strong, the wild horses are kept perfectly in check. So next time you feel the overwhelming urge to check your phone during a conversation, think of this. That urge is a wild horse. Your intellect is the charioteer deciding whether to pull the reins or just let the horses run wild. It's a ridiculously precise, ancient framework for what modern psychologists call executive control and impulse management. Let's talk about modern cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Today, CBT is basically the gold standard for treating anxiety and depression. It works by teaching patients that their thoughts actively shape their emotions, which then shape their behaviors. Change your thoughts and you literally rewire your brain. We treat this like a massive modern psychological breakthrough. Yet thousands of years before CBT was a thing, the ancient Rig Veda had already identified this exact mechanism. They dropped this profound, awe-inspiring insight. As a person thinks, so he becomes. They literally understood neuroplasticity long before we even had a clinical word for it. And this understanding of the mind builds into a really profound view of self-awareness. In the Chandogya Upanishad, there's this beautiful story of a father teaching his kind of arrogant son about true identity. He takes a handful of salt, dissolves it into a bowl of water, and asks his son if he can see the salt. No, the son says. Then the father asks, well, can you taste it? The son takes a sip. Yes, it's everywhere. By comparing the self to invisible salt in water, this ancient lesson illustrates that your true identity, captured in the phrase tat twam asi, or you are that, is a subtle, all-pervading essence. It's something way deeper than your physical body, your passing thoughts, or your social status. Which brings us to Section 4, the concept of ego. Understanding that invisible essence brings us to a massive philosophical divergence in how the East and the West view identity. In Western psychology, the ego is heavily prioritized. It's our individualistic experience of personal identity, basically the core of our psychological reality. We spend years in therapy trying to build a healthy ego. But the Eastern equivalent, ahamkara, which translates to the I sense, is totally different. Put simply, if someone insults your favorite pair of shoes, your Western ego feels personally attacked, right? Because it closely identifies with your preferences. The Eastern framework, though, treats ahamkara as just an automatic, unconscious mechanism of the mind. It recognizes that the real you wasn't insulted at all. It's just your ahamkara generating attachment. The ego isn't who you are. It's honestly just a temporary app running in the background. And finally, Section 5, Transcending the Self. So if the ego is just a mechanism of attachment, an app running in the background, what happens when you close it? What lies beyond it? This leap brings us to transpersonal psychology. In the history of modern psychology, there have basically been three major forces. First was psychoanalysis, diving into the unconscious. Second was behaviorism, looking at actions. Third was humanism, focusing on personal growth. Well, transpersonal psychology is widely considered the fourth force. It represents the ultimate evolution of the field, the journey from the isolated individual mind to a unitive, transcendent state of consciousness. What's amazing is that modern science is finally catching up to ancient wisdom here. Transpersonal psychology actively studies our highest potentials, those incredible, transcendent peak experiences where you feel this overwhelming peace and unity with the universe. Even Abraham Maslow realized this. We all know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Food and shelter at the bottom, moving up to self-actualization at the top. But what a lot of people don't know is that later in his life, Maslow actually realized his own famous pyramid was incomplete. He added a step above self-actualization, self-transcendence. This branch of psychology is now scientifically validating what Indian traditions knew all along. True healing and ultimate potential are only unlocked when we step completely outside the concepts of me and mine. So I'm going to leave you with this to chew on. Take a quick inventory of your identities right now. Think about your profession,
Think about your role in your family. Are you a parent, a sibling, a child? Think about your gender, your social status, your hobbies. Got them? Okay, now, if you strip literally all of that away, when the ego is completely removed, who are you? It is absolutely a question worth exploring. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep expanding your mind.